all your senses are assaulted in terms of sound, but it's just a complete mash of noise.
Welcome back, everybody, to the My Generation podcast. On today's show, we're taking a little bit of a step outside of the county of Kent. Previously on the My Generation podcast, we had producer Daniel Johnson on the show. We were talking about what we did for Screen South, and there is where I met Frazer Merrick, who is the creator of Hidden Sounds of the Coastal Arcade. And before you even consider listening to this episode of the podcast, head straight into the description of this podcast, either on YouTube or Soundcloud, and you can find the BBC Sounds link to Frazer's project. You can listen to that on there because Frazer explored Walton Pier, which is in North Essex, to go over a sort of documentary, soundscaping, creating experiential sound design project. And he's on the show with us today. Welcome, Frazer.
Hello.
Well, thank you very much for coming on today. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be able to talk about my project in this kind of format. It's a new thing for me, so it's really exciting.
Yeah, and it's a way to sort of, now that you've probably listened to Frazer's project, to get an idea of the sort of behind the scenes of it. So you're exploring the coastal area of Walton Pier. Would you say it is a documentary style experience? How would you describe your project?
It's fascinating. As you talk more and more, or as I've been talking more and more about it, I've kind of learnt, I've discovered what it is that I've made, really, because I kind of went into it really wanting to make a piece of music about the place, but I realised that I needed to put that music in context of the people and the environment. So it kind of sits somewhere between soundscape and documentary. So it's, there are elements of oral history, there's lots of interviews, but then I use those in an overtly compositional way, chopping them up, synthesizing them, processing them to make music outright. So I like to exist in these blurry lines between genres, which is really annoying when you're trying to describe your work.
Yeah, and well, going firstly to those interviews, how did you end up getting in touch with these people? Were they people you already knew who were interested in the project, or did you sort of meet them as you went along?
A mixture of both, really. So a lot of them was me walking up to people with my producer, Nick Walker. We walked up to people on the pier and said, "Hi there. We're making a piece of music about the pier. Can we ask you a couple of questions?" And of course, you get a lot of people saying, "Oh, absolutely not. Leave me alone. I'm just here to have fun. Go away." But you also get some people who are quite willing to talk about their relationship with the place. We met people who had come back after being there as a child. And then we also did shout outs on local Facebook groups. So there's like a community Facebook group for Walton, and we were looking for people who had more like nostalgic and historic memories of the place. So we interviewed, there's a gentleman in the middle who talks about being underneath the pier. He was actually the chap who built the bowling alley at the back. So yeah, we found people like him, which was really exciting. And then the woman you hear at the start of the piece and at the end is actually a former TV presenter who lives in the area. She was great because she could just speak in sound bites. She knew exactly to repeat the question in the answer. She was really good at giving sort of short, snappy phrases, which was really nice to play with in the edit because it was so succinct.
Yeah, and she probably gave you a lot of freedom in that edit because, she's done this all before. I mean, well, for you, because you've got so many people's different experiences with it, what is the connection that you and your producer have with that existing pier?
So it's I don't really have much of a connection with Walton per se. I grew up in the south of Essex, down in Thurrock, in Grays, and so I have more of a connection, say, with Southend. And I'd go there we'd go there some Friday evenings, maybe with friends and family. Peter Pan's playground down the pier, etc. So I've got an affinity to the seaside and to the arcade, in Essex. And originally, I wanted to make this piece of music that covered all of the various locations along the coastline of Essex, and I realised that was fundamentally far too ambitious given the time that I had. So I decided to pick one place and spend more time at a single place. So originally it was going to be Southend, Clacton, and Walton, and then I scaled that back to say, right, why don't I spend a bit more time at one of those places? And I ended up picking Walton because it was furthest away from London. Really, it was more end of the line, and I felt like for me that was more interesting.
Yeah, and I think the screen south process definitely helps you sort of make your process succinct, because I know when I was talking about my process, the script starts off quite big and you have all these massive ideas, but then they help you sort of it makes more quality with a smaller amount of things happening, and so you focused on that because it's the furthest away and the most sort of rural and on its own almost.
Yeah, so Peter Hoare were one of the execs, and Simon Elms, the other exec on my project, were fantastic at that, at sort of helping me to polish the idea, from into something more complete. So I originally I really did want to just record the sounds of the arcades, and it was through conversations with them that they kept asking me why, and I realised I was trying to capture a sense of the place, and they were like, well, why don't you spend more time in one place? Why don't you interview people? And I was like, oh yeah, of course. And it all come, and having them to bounce off was brilliant, and they were really, really supportive throughout the whole process.
Yeah, and so that was bringing the interview side of it in, but it sounds like the sort of soundscape bit, you had a picture in your head since the beginning of that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I've always been really interested in, is field recording. When it comes to writing music, I really struggle with like your blank canvas. I don't like working from nothing. I like to have something to bounce off. I'm really interested in collaboration and improvisation, and so field recording for me is it's like going out and kind of capturing a palette of colours to work from. I have loads of resources then that I can play around with and I can be inspired by. So I already knew all the things I wanted to record, or rather I had an idea of the things I wanted to record, and I was excited to explore the place and try and find unexpected sounds.
Well, one of my favourite parts in the whole piece is the part where the coin machines that you can hear becomes the sound of the lights.
Yeah.
Because you've mentioned to me before, and I'd love you to explain to the listeners here, that you've got a microphone that records the sound that light makes. What is that for someone who doesn't know what that is, and how did you use it in this project?
Yeah, so I've got a electromagnetic field microphone, which got some very perplexing looks when I was around the arcade pointing this gadget at the lights. One woman thought I was actually diddling the machines, was her exact words, but no. So what this microphone does is it picks up the magnetic fields produced by any electrical items, or not even electrical items. It will pick up any magnetic field, but this is specifically tuned to work well with electrical circuits. So anything that is creating a current will create a magnetic field at the same time, and then the amplifier inside this circuit kind of turns that into a current so we can hear it. So what that turns into is that if you see a flashing light, every time it flashes, it's giving out a small magnetic pulse as well. This microphone picks that up, and now those flashing lights, which you see as a rhythm, you're now hearing that rhythm of those lights. So there's a section in the middle where there's like a really intense sort of techno breakdown, and that all comes from this one punch bag machine that was in the fairground section of the amusement area, and it was brilliant because it uncovered this whole other layer of sound to the place that otherwise is totally unknown to human ears.
Yeah, and is that where the project started from, or did it start from the sound of the sea and the coin machines? Where was the moment you were like, this is the project that I'm making?
Oh, it was totally that sound, yeah. It was. I got the microphone a while ago. I think I saw an Andrew Huang video. It's by a LOM label, Jonas, and he makes these microphones. And Andrew Huang, YouTuber, did a video on them, and I was like, I need one of these. This is so cool. And then a friend of mine asked, she needed to do a like a mini documentary for a module at university, and said, can I just film you doing some field recording stuff? And I was like, oh, I want to take this microphone somewhere. And so, I'm really lazy. I'm really good at procrastinating, so I need deadlines. And when someone says, can I record you doing a thing? I was like, okay, what is it I wanted to do but maybe haven't found the energy to do it? And so we went down to I think it was Felixstowe, and we recorded an arcade there, and I was like, oh, this is insane. And it was from there I knew, right, I want to spend more time in a place with one of these microphones and discover all these different sounds.
Yeah, and I bet that was something you used quite early on in the Screen South pitching process. I mean, if we take it all the way back to the beginning, because me and Dan, we explored when we were talking about our process, like what it was like from the very, very start. What was it like in that very first interview explaining your idea for Screen South?
There were so many people in my interview. It was quite daunting, trying to get across what it was that I wanted to do. I think because it's quite experimental as well, fairly avant-garde to try and be recording the sounds of circuits. So trying to get that across, I actually brought the microphone with me, this electromagnetic field microphone, and plugged it into my headphones. And I just said to people, like, okay, point this at your phone or your laptop and listen to the Mad soundtrack. And that got a really good response from the panel. They were all like, what is this? And I was like, cool, now imagine that in an arcade. And they're like, okay, cool. So
yeah, they start to understand it then.
Yeah, exactly. Show don't tell. So that worked really well. Just sort of explain, rather than trying to, because it's really hard to explain sounds. I thought the best option was just to play them some stuff or let them listen to the sounds themselves.
Yeah, just actually bringing it in and making them see it in front of you. Yeah, it's great because instead of having like an elevator pitch, you can just go in with the thing. I wanted to ask, because me and Dan explored this, what was it like the moment that you found out that your project had been accepted? Where were you? What was it like when you got the email or the phone call?
It's a really good question. I was I can't quite remember where I was. I think I might have been at work actually, but I was super excited because it was really one of the first times that I've made I've done a lot of small projects as an individual, and I've done kind of small making projects, but this really felt like a level up, especially work, to say you're having some work going to be potentially at the time aired on BBC. That was incredible, as an individual, not through a band I was in or an organisation I was working for, but for me as as an artist outright. It felt really validating, and that was amazing, really, really exciting.
Yeah, and from that point on, the process of working begins. I remember what you said about deadlines and needing to keep to them. I had an in-depth look at your EP and how you've set the deadlines with seasons. So every season you're going to be releasing a new EP because that keeps you on track. And later on in the show, we're actually going to be playing some of Frazer's music, so definitely stay tuned for that. It's another great episode where we get to actually play the music from the artist here on the My Generation podcast. But I wanted to bring it back to this specific Screen South process. What was your creative process like, working with deadlines, working with execs, and all of that?
So because my piece wasn't necessarily I didn't have a script per se, I had a loose outline. Really what I needed to do was just to spend loads of time on the pier recording. So I think with along with my producer Nick, we went maybe like 6 or 7 times where we just spent the whole day at the pier, on bank holidays, like on afternoons, midweek, Sunday mornings, trying to kind of capture different sounds at different times of day, because different people come at different times, etc., etc. So a lot of the process really was just listening, going out and hanging around and getting to know the staff, getting to know the people, and just sort of being there.
Yeah, I think what was nice about the Screen South process was that everyone's projects seemed to have had like different things you needed to do. So for me and Dan, because we were working with actors and it existed lots in emails, and we made it on one day. Whereas your creative process, you think, actually went across a much longer period of time because you were like absorbing so much stuff.
Yeah, months mine took. And it was I mean, at the start, one thing we were really worried about was trying to get clearance for the music playing from the arcade machines. And we spent days, or Nick spent weeks really, trying to contact these arcade machine manufacturers to see if it was okay, if their music was going to be in the background of this radio piece. and they're like impossible to get hold of. And in the end, we managed to get through to one company, and they were like, "Yes, fine, do what you want." I mean, like, cool, can we just get that in writing, please? And they were like, right, Nick's like, you're okay to record over here. But of course, when you're in the magnetic field, the electromagnetic field spectrum, then the music kind of, copyright doesn't, it's not that copyright doesn't exist, but that's not what they've copyrighted at that point. So it was that was like a whole other thing I hadn't thought of. And like in the fairground section of the pier, they had this really loud music playing, like obnoxiously loud. And it turns out it's to cover the sounds of the rides. So like the waltzers are really loud and mechanical, clattering bangs. And that would be terrifying if you just heard that. So they pumped the music really loud to generate an atmosphere, but also to cover the sounds of the rides. Unfortunately, it's just a Spotify playlist, so there's no way I'm going to get clearance for Mamma Mia. My budget definitely didn't cover that, so we had to get to know the staff to say, like, look, can you at certain times they would let us turn the music off for a brief section, but they'd only let us do that on like once a day, and not on the bank holidays. Like, I walked up to him once on a bank holiday and he looked at me and he was like, "You got to be kidding, right? This is our busiest day of the year. There's no way I'm turning the music off now." And I was like, "Okay, fair, that's fair." So you've got to build those relationships and push them where you feel you can, but also know that you're there, and they're being kind enough to let you there record. You can't be a nuisance.
Yeah, and it's all those sort of little things that you don't see building up until you're there on set. I mean, you probably didn't even think about these before the project started.
No, not at all. Not at all.
And so next I want to just move through the journey that you take when you're listening to this, because it starts off in the arcade and then goes on to the fairground and then the pier itself at the end. How did you sort of, because you said you worked without a script, how did that sort of narrative journey take place? Was that all done in the edit?
Pretty much. So because all the sounds come from different visits, there's not necessarily, I didn't go there one day and say, right, I'm going to record the arcade today. As we, at the end of each session, we were logging the sounds, and we had a big spreadsheet of like how many recordings we had from each place, and we were kind of like noting really good parts we think might be good. I was very slowly building an edit I use Logic for editing. So I was kind of building an edit as I was going a little bit, but mostly just like, what do I think are really good recordings? It was about the recording itself rather than anything else. And then as we got further into the process, I did start to kind of loosely structure the piece, and then I was like, right, I'm really missing this, or I could do with a few more sounds of that. So when we went back, we had more targeted sessions, like, okay, we're going to hang out just in this space, or we really need to try and get some interviews today. So we were as I was kind of editing as we were going, so it meant that I could be a bit more targeted with the recording towards the end of the project.
And what was the reason for using Logic as your editing tool?
I mean, I've used it for over a decade, so it's no other choice than that, really. It's kind of what I'm comfortable in. I did have to move, so from I did my edit in Logic, and then I did a track lay in Pro Tools, and then we did the final mix in Pro Tools.
Amazing, yeah, because we used Pro Tools for our project, and yeah, they sort of have all their own unique benefits. But we're going to be going back to Frazer in just a moment to continue our discussion about hidden sounds of the Coastal Arcade. Just want to remind you that the link for that is in the description. You can find that on BBC Sounds. Please check it out. It's an incredible project. Just going to go through some more stuff we've got coming up on the show. Then we're going to be playing one of the songs from Frazer's Summer EP. So, just wanted to let you know that we are available on YouTube and SoundCloud. SoundCloud is fairly new to the My Generation podcast, but if you're listening on YouTube and you want to listen on SoundCloud, you can find the link in the description. And every single week on the My Generation podcast, starting in March of this year, we're having Sammy Bacon. He's a local Kent music enthusiast who will be doing an album recommendation each and every single week here on the My Generation podcast. And that begins officially in March from his episode where he'll be talking about some of his favourite albums. And from every week on the show, an album recommendation. We're going to play one here for you this week. It's just going to be a 1-minute quick fire album recommendation here on the My Generation podcast. But here is the album that Sammy recommends this week.
Hi guys, Sammy Bacon here to give you another album recommendation. This week the recommendation is Rain Dogs by Tom Waits. Rain Dogs is the 8th studio album by the singer-songwriter, and it's a further departure from the first half of his career, which was mainly jazz-soaked piano ballads, and into a more experimental and avant-garde stylings with more abstract lyricism, but still keeping up Tom Waits' sort of signature style of writing about characters. It also continues his junkyard percussion stylings, which started with Swordfish Trombones, which was released before this album, and the music feels physical and brutal and clangy, I guess. When Tom Waits was making this album, he actually recorded street sound, and you really feel that sort of city-like physicality and brutality in the music itself. Like I said, Tom Waits begins to tell these sordid stories of disturbed people on songs like Big Black Mariah, Clap Hands, Walking Spanish. But there is a somewhat softer side to Rain Dogs as well. You get Blind Love, which is this country ballad which turns up nearing the end of the album. It's just a beautiful song. You also have Time, which is just this stripped back, just Tom and an acoustic guitar. And yeah, this album is a classic. If you want to hear something brutal and slightly hard to listen to, but all the more gratifying for getting through it, Rain Dogs is a must listen. Yeah, check it out. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you for that, Sammy, and we'll be tuning in with Sammy every single week going from March on the My Generation podcast onwards for a brand new album that you should be listening to. Keeping along the musical theme, we're now going to be moving into Frazer's Summer EP. We usually play a band feature on the show, but today we've got the audio from 2 of his songs for the 4 seasons he's going to be making of EPs. And we're going to be playing Carousel here on the My Generation podcast. And here is that song by Frazer Merrick. And that was Carousel by Frazer Merrick here on the My Generation podcast. Frazer, before we move back into Screen South, would you like to just briefly talk about what this summer EP means and how it all came to be?
Yeah, thank you. So I've spent a long time in bands at university and after the fact, and when I moved to Colchester in 2015, I found myself, I was only ever really making music when I had a piece of work in front of me, a commission, and I was kind of losing the fun of music. So I realized that I had to kind of self-set some deadlines to really get that creativity flowing. So initially that turned into I did a 52 weeks of music project where I tried to write a song every week. I think I got about 3 months into that before I lost the energy. But I'd made a lot of music. But more recently, I've challenged myself to do an EP every season. So I've got a theme of that season, and I started off with the summer one. And a lot of the sounds on that come from circuit bending, which is something I've got into over the last year or so. So that is the art of taking old musical toys mostly, opening them up and messing around with the circuits. Quite literally sometimes licking your hands and poking the circuits and seeing what squeals and squeaks and glitches they make, and then adding like potentiometers, knobs and faders and buttons and whatnot, to kind of create these custom sounds. So that track Carousel features at the end, especially you can hear there's like a really squelchy, glitchy drone towards the end. That all comes from a couple of different keyboards that I've circuit bent.
Well, it's great because I can actually tell that this is the same person who made this Screen South project. There's just something about it that when I was listening to the music ahead of today's show, that I just felt the same energy from it, and sort of linking the two of them together really, because I could feel that same energy coming from both. What do you think the link is between music and soundscape, and where do you think the lines blur?
Ooh, that's a big question. So I approach both of the mediums. I guess all I can talk about really is the way that I approach it. I approach both of them in a very playful way. So circuit bending for me is playing. I sit there, open it up, I'll have a recorder plugged in, and I'll just explore and sort of see what happens. And then I make a kind of overt decision to say, right, I really like that section. I'm gonna loop it. I'm gonna sample it, and then I'm gonna turn it into something. Arguably, soundscape maybe doesn't have the same way of processing, so things aren't as rigid or as structured. They're a bit looser in their shape or in their duration, things like that. So I guess it's maybe the way that you're presenting the sounds potentially, or rather the way you're framing the sounds. But yeah, those lines are really blurry because there are, you look at, say, John Cage with 4 minutes 33. That's a song, right? But it's a different song every time you hear it. So it's kind of more of a live soundscape. So it's somewhere in between the two.
I didn't realise how close the lines were blurred until I really listened to your piece, and you just feel that. And even through this song, there are bits of both, because circuit breaking is not music, one could argue, but then you've made an entire EP out of it. I just wanted to ask about, because you clearly think in terms of sounds. When I get inspirations for projects, because I'm also a film student. There's a lot that goes into it visually, and when you talk about the area of Colchester, that's quite vivid for me because my dad's from Walton Pier, so when you're playing these sounds, I can see the pier. And when I was making my project, even though it was a soundscape, there was a lot of visual imagery that I looked at. Did you look at books and photos of the sea area to get inspiration at all, even though this was a sound project?
When I was interviewing the gentleman who built part of the arcade on the pier, I did find some pictures to have that chat with him, because they're really good at evoking a memory or a bit of nostalgia. But otherwise, not really. I think in terms of sound and almost emotion, really. So I definitely I like doing graphic scores. So I'll often quite draw the shape of the piece I want to do. So I've got some sort of visual frame.
What is a graphic score?
Sorry, yeah. So a graphic score is like a personal version of notation. So rather than sitting there with traditional music notation, because my piece would be very hard to score it with traditional notation, instead I might do it with lines and shapes and colours, and just have a visual representation of how I maybe want the shape of the piece to go. Yeah.
Oh, it's really interesting seeing everyone's different creative processes, because I would never be able to work like that. That's amazing. Well, just wanted to ask you, the listener, really. Well, that's what Frazer and I have had to say so far about the subject, talking about Screen South, talking about hidden sounds of the Coastal Arcade. Do you have something you want to say about the subject? Maybe what Frazer has said today has inspired you to get involved in working in sound in some medium, because the medium is just so creative. If so, leave us a comment here on YouTube or Soundcloud, or you can get in touch with the Facebook page at the My Generation Podcast. But Frazer, if people wanted to follow you personally, where would they go to do that?
Probably best places are Twitter or Instagram. That's where I post most of the stuff that I'm up to. And that is my name, Frazer Merrick, Frazer Merrick.
Amazing. And we'll put all Frazer's links in the description below so you can follow all of his upcoming work. Next, we usually on this show move on to local impacts, because the show is very much based in Kent. And this definitely qualifies for the show, because Screen South was the southeast thing, so it all works out. But if someone in your position, or someone just starting out in the world of sound, was just getting into, they're picking up their first microphones, they're exploring soundscape building and field work like you are, what would you recommend to someone who's taking those first steps to do to get involved?
Blimey. I think there's a really good Ira Glass, who's an American radio host, video about ability and taste, and how when you first start out, your taste is amazing, but your skill hasn't quite caught up with it. And most people give up before their ability matches their taste. So the only way you can really get past that is just to make a volume of work and to keep making and keep making. No one likes their work the first time they hear it. It's only until you've done lots of it that you start to get better and better and better. So really, the best piece of advice I can give to anyone is just to make loads of stuff, to keep recording and keep making, and explore new formats, and go wherever you want to, but just keep at it.
Yeah, like what you did with that album or that song every week for the year. It just tests you to see if you can do it, doesn't it? And I bet you learned quite a lot from that, even though you didn't complete it.
Yeah, I was trying out different styles, different instrumentation, different formats. It was just pushing myself in different directions. The reason I gave up is because I started getting loads of work coming through. So I didn't need to, it was fascinating.
Which is never a bad thing. Well, yeah. I assume, though, that because you've built up this sort of body of work and the Screen South on top of that, it sort of helps people see what you can do, and then more work floods in because they know the calibre of your work.
Yeah, I'm at this point in my career now where I'm really starting to bring all the different sides, all my interests together, and they're kind of culminating in larger projects. So, I do installation work, and then I also do making music, releasing EPs, and I run a music charity which is based a lot around improvisation. And so I'm now finding ways in which all these different ideas come together into projects, which is really exciting.
Amazing. And you're obviously going to start to become an inspiration to people just getting into it. I wanted to ask again for just a little bit of advice for if someone has seen this and now they want to get involved in that next round of Screen South submissions. What would you recommend for someone who knows they want to do sound, but they haven't maybe yet got their idea, and it's just starting to form in their head? They get in the sort of early spots. What would you recommend so when they go in for the Screen South process and they do an interview or apply, that they're ready?
It's really hard to describe sounds fundamentally. So I think if you can give any examples of what you had in mind, then that's really, really handy, because people otherwise, they bring their own knowledge of sound and they're basing it on what they might know. So if you have any examples of stuff that you can play, that's fantastic. Or if you can reference existing pieces of work that you're inspired by, then that will really help explain what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, because I remember when me and Dan submitted, when we went away and actually recorded interviews of people talking about what would happen if the internet went down, because that was the subject of our piece.
Yeah,
we actually took the raw interviews to Screen South that they could actually, and we edited it as if it was a real package. So whilst like the sound quality was a bit lower on it and it wasn't a polished edit, they could then actually hear that. And so you're just
that's
so
perfect.
right on that. So I'm just going to, before we go back to Frazer, I've got one more question to ask him. I'm just going to tease a few more topics we've got coming up on the podcast, as well as podcast topics that I would like people to get in touch with if they want to get involved. So, next topics coming up on the My Generation podcast. We have returning podcast guest Harry Monday. He is back talking about the fact he was a swimming instructor. So he comes onto the show to talk about what it was like being an instructor and his journey through that. We've got Lewis Schofield. He's on the show talking about the novel writing process. We had George Shaft on the podcast for episode number 20, talking about his own novel writing process. And Lewis has got a slightly different one for his fantasy novel writing, and he'll be on the show shortly. As well as returning podcast guest Daniel Inwards. He's back every 13 episodes on the show, and he'll be talking about travel. Dan's been travelling to France and Belgium recently, and he's going to be painting a picture of his travelling experiences. And now we're just going to be going back to Frazer in a moment to wrap up this week's episode of the My Generation podcast. But there are future topics that we're still looking for people to talk about. I want to talk to a graphic designer, the wonderful world of creating digital artwork. It's not a massive strength of mine, and I don't have the brain for it, and I just want to speak to someone who's big on graphic design. So if that's you, and you're between the ages of 18 and 35, we usually talk to people in the area of Kent, but Frazer is an infiltrator for today's episode, coming from Essex. Then do get in touch with the Facebook page at the My Generation podcast, where we'll be also posting questions that you can answer, so maybe we'll even have one of your texts or comments featured on the show soon. All links again in the description. Now, before I ask Frazer one last question, I just wanted to go back to his summer EP, and we're going to be playing one more song from that EP on today's episode of the My Generation podcast. It's the song Evolve. And Frazer, is there anything you wanted to say about Evolve before we play it?
Listen out for, or try and spot the circuit bent sounds if you can. Try and work out what you think is a standard synth and what is one that I've made myself.
Amazing. Yeah, leave your comments below saying what parts of Evolve you think are what. Here on the My Generation podcast, here is Frazer's summer EP. We're featuring the song Evolve. is Evolve by Frazer Merrick here on the My Generation podcast. Frazer, just my last question to you, and it's one we ask every guest when we come to the end of an episode of the show. What do you think you've learned by talking about your project here on today's episode of the podcast?
I think a lot of the decisions I make as an artist are quite unconscious. I know a lot of this process, especially when I'm in the edit, and I was editing this piece. It was 3 a.m. the day before it was due, and I've been listening to it for 12 hours straight or whatever, and you're making these decisions, and you're not maybe aware of the decisions you're making. So it's through conversations like this that you really start to understand your own process. So I feel like explaining the inception of the idea was really useful to me, understanding where it's all stemmed from, and then how it expanded out to include more things. So yeah, I think just speaking out loud about the piece really, for me, turns what was an unconscious decision into more of a conscious one, and helps me then explain what I do much better in the future.
Oh, amazing. And just actually quickly springboarding off of that, what after this project's now completed, and also this Screen South process is never the end of once you complete your project, because it leads on to hopefully a career in the thing that you are making, whether it's video, sound, or VR. So Frazer, what's your next upcoming projects that people can get excited about and ready to listen to?
I'm developing a couple of different ideas at the moment. I'm really interested in making more music in the arcade. I think the flashing lights and all the motors and everything with my EMF microphone, there's whole other palettes of sounds that I've barely scratched the surface of. But this project really helped me understand that what the core part of my work is play, and understanding that. So I'm exploring other ideas at the moment around a bicycle orchestra, and then also thinking about what the future of the fairground might look like as well. So that's an idea I want to develop a bit further.
Well, amazing. And we'd love to have you back on the show to talk about that in the future.
That'd be great.
Yeah, well, no, thank you very much for joining us today, Frazer.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Well, we'll definitely get Frazer back on the show to talk about more of his crazy soundscape bending ideas, and please check out his Instagram in the link below, because I've been following it over the past few weeks, and I mean I work in sound, I work in radio, and my mind is still baffled by what I see. Hidden Sounds of the Coastal Arcade is down in the description below. You please check it out. It's incredible if you haven't listened already, and you listen through this first, and then you can listen to his straight after tuning into today's episode of the show. We've got Harry swimming next. We've got Lewis talking about the novel writing process, and Dan with travel. So many really, really great topics here on the My Generation podcast, and more throughout every Thursday at 6 p.m. here on YouTube and Soundcloud. Please subscribe and turn on post notifications so you never, ever miss a new episode every single Thursday at 6 p.m. Thank you again, Frazer.
Thank you very much.
And we'll tune in with you all next week for the next episode of the My Generation podcast.